One of the main criticisms of the N64 by some gamers is the fact that Nintendo often had a kid-friendly image to uphold. You often think of squeaky clean characters like Mario, Banjo and Donkey Kong, and some of the console's sickly sweet titles like Yoshi's Story. It may surprise you then to learn that around 10% of the Nintendo 64 games released in the West held a mature rating from the ESRB. This as a percentage is actually higher than the PlayStation 1 library, which is often associated as having a much more adult-based content library, although naturally the PS1 library is vast in comparison to that of the N64. And so for today's episode we're taking a look at each time the N64 went M-Rated. Before we begin, it's best to clear up what makes the ESRB give a game a mature rating. Typically, titles in this category may contain mature sexual themes, more intense violence levels, and also strong language. Now that's not an exhaustive list, but it acts as a base. And I'd just like to also point out that if you do want an in-depth review of any of the titles featured in this list, then go to the video description where I'll put a link to all 28 games which I've previously reviewed in full. Maester Dark Age was a 1997 arcade fighting game from Atari Midway, whose PlayStation 1 version was cancelled. In the 12th century, a group of nations called the Covenant of Seven sent their best warriors to kill a dark arts master who wields the legendary Mace of Tanis. The game originally had over 30 character designs for it, but this was trimmed down to a lower number after holding focus groups with teenagers. Whilst the fighting is brutal, bloody, and there's plenty of environmental damage, it was the fact that you have the ability to perform executions on your opponents in the same way as fatalities in the Mortal Kombat series. Beheadings, hearts being ripped out, and slicing your enemies' limbs off one by one were all surely reasons why nothing but an M rating would suffice here. Still, despite the somewhat poor gameplay, the game is a treat to look at, and it's definitely one worth checking out considering how few fighting games the Nintendo 64 has. Doom 64 was a unique title for the Nintendo 64, and it's one which didn't sell so well on its release in 1997, but it's become quite the cult classic on the console. If you're a fan of Doom as a whole, then I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. It takes place after Final Doom and contains all brand new levels, some cool new enemies to the series, and also some unique weaponry. What got this game its M rating was the amount of gore, which is intense, although many complain about the overall darkness to levels, which may make actually seeing the gore a little more challenging. Also pay attention to the sublime ambient soundtrack to the game, which I personally think is one of the best that the Nintendo 64 has to offer. In a fun fact, Midway Vice President at the time Mike Abbott was concerned that Nintendo would try and censor the amount of violence in the game before its release, as Nintendo had just removed the ability to run over animals in Cruisin' USA on the console. But alas, those concerns were never raised and the game was released as they had always planned. Perhaps the strangest game to get an M rating was Forsaken. The spiritual successor to the incredible Descent games from the 90s, this 360-degree shooter takes place in an alternative future. With science having pretty much decimated the Earth, it has been declared condemned, and only the bravest and scummiest mercenaries enter it for salvage. When I actually saw this game had an M rating, for the life of me I couldn't see why. It's a decent sci-fi shooter, and most of the enemies are robotic. But after digging into this, apparently it got its M rating for one reason. The intro found in the CD-based versions of the game contained a sequence with some violent deaths, but this wasn't in the Nintendo 64 version, which instead had in-game engine intros. So the sole reason this release on N64 got an M rating was because you blow up into bits when killed in the game. Definitely the softest M rating, but don't let that put you off. This is a great game, and there's also the remaster now available in Steam on Xbox One. Nightmare Creatures is a 1998 gothic horror third-person action game which most people remember more commonly as being a PlayStation title. The game begins in the year 1666 when a devil-worshipping brotherhood conduct experiments trying to create superhumans. Things naturally went wrong and they instead created horrible monsters which basically take over London. The game is cool in a sense that they link the story into real life events such as the Great Fire of London, and and although the combat can quickly begin to get a bit repetitive, it's a good romp from start to finish and it's definitely worth checking out. Sadly though, all of the cool CD based versions cutscenes were removed and the N64 version was made a little easier by way of platforming changes and an optional feature to turn off health depletion. This game received its M rating for its level of violence, which includes a fair splattering of gore, as well as the ability to decapitate and hack into pieces the zombie-like enemies you come up against. Although not a reason for an M rating, this game also contains quite a few jump scare moments, and the overall dark tone of the game has made it a favourite for those seeking something more horror based on the platform. Midway were known for their fighting games, and in another attempt to find the next Mortal Kombat, they published Biofreaks. Released in 1998, the game takes place in the not too distant future, where America is divided once more into 50 separate zones. Technology and bioengineering have grown at such a crazy rate that a new organisation called the Secret Games Commission has been set up to create a tournament to decide who takes over control of Neo America. Sure, the storyline is hammy, but the character designs are quite cool, and each of the game's characters acts as a champion for the corporation that they're representing. It has a cool polygonal engine and 10 characters including the bosses. The most unique thing about the game is the controls, which assign buttons to specific limbs and the ability to fly in the arenas. Now this game was given its M rating for a couple of reasons, none of which will shock you. Certain strong attacks in the game can actually take off your opponent's limbs while mid-game, leaving them at a disadvantage as they try to continue to battle on with less moves. Secondly, you have the mutilations, which pretty much act like Mortal Kombat's fatalities, but these can happen anytime in battle, even as a first attack. Overall though, this one is just an average fighting game. The gore is a nice addition, but it's not a game that I feel will keep most players coming back to. Shadow Man is one of my all-time personal favourite games. The Metroidvania style third-person horror it contained, as well as the storyline which is up there with some of the coolest ever made that game this way for me. There is in fact so much to say about it that I would recommend that you watch my full review of it, but also the mini documentary I made on the serial killer's history in the game. I just couldn't cover everything in this video. What I will say though is that this was probably the most clear-cut M rating on the list. In the opening sequence of the game, Jack the Ripper commits suicide by stabbing himself, complete with blood-curling gargles as he dies. Throw in the mix the dark serial killers as bosses, the religious undertones to the game, and the insane amount of gore. I mean, come on, in order to transport in the game you do so via amputated corpses which are crucified. Officially the game got the M rating for animated blood, gore and violence, but the ESRB really could have picked any element of the game and slapped it with an M rating. As is the case with all Mortal Kombat games on the Nintendo 64, Trilogy received its M rating due to realistic blood and gore and realistic violence. As a standalone update to Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, Trilogy divides opinion. Some love its lack of load times and speed, whilst others prefer the PlayStation version's extra animation and music. The debate will always continue, but if you're a fan of the series you know what you're going to get with this title. The fatalities are as cool as ever, and although I personally prefer brutalities, the game packs in so much action that for an early N64 release landing in 1996, it's probably a game which many people still hold in their collections. In a cool feature, this release also has a supreme demonstration feature, and this allows you to watch every fatality, babality, animality, friendship and brutality back to back for every character. Carmageddon 64 is one of the worst N64 games to get an M rating. If you're a fan of the great PC games, then avoid this one like the plague, because as an overall package it's just a very poor game. This one picked up the M rating for animated blood, gore and violence as you mow down human looking zombies as part of your gaming action. The most interesting thing about this though is that some versions of the game are quite unique. In the North American version the pedestrian's blood is green, in PAL it's red, but in the German version they have been replaced entirely with dinosaurs to get around the country's notoriously strict laws on gaming violence. No matter which version of the game you play though, the overall game just isn't fun, and it rightly deserved the low review scores it got back in mid-2000. As one reviewer put it, this shows what happens when you give a good PC game to a studio to port and they don't know what to do with it. Conkers Bad Fur Day is one of the most notorious games on the Nintendo 64, but it's also one of the most well loved. Originally planned as yet another cute 3D platformer, few could ever have imagined the about-face that the game would undergo. It's one of only 2 M-Rated N64 games that got its rating in part due to having mature sexual themes, but the animated violence and strong language also helped to ensure that Rare's most adult game on the console would certainly make the headlines. So concerned were both Nintendo and Rare that this game would end up in the hands of kids that on the front of the box they slapped an explicit warning that the game was not suitable for minors. Of course, like many kids, that never stopped me getting my hands on the game. But in a funny twist, some magazines back in the day actually boycotted coverage of the game in protest against the direction that the game took. But in the words of Eric Bischoff, controversy creates cash. With plenty of crude humour, sexually suggestive innuendos, and even one scene with attempted sodomy, Conkers Bad Fur Day is a riot from start to finish. And make sure you're playing the uncensored version, as the original Xbox release didn't do the original justice. Despite having an insanely expensive launch price, the sheer excitement that Turok Dinosaur Hunter garnered before launch meant this was one game which many N64 early adopters were happy to splash the cash to own. With both human and dinosaur enemies, the game really showed its M rating with the cool weaponry. Being able to slice and dice an enemy including their neck arteries, which would spray blood everywhere as they slowly dropped to the ground. Animated blood, gore and violence were the reason for the M rating, but importantly it showed early on in the console's lifespan that Nintendo were not going to be as strict with censorship as they had been in the past. Of course, despite the M rating, I happily played this in my childhood like many of you watching. And although by today's standards it seems timid, at the time there was something very satisfying about a more adult feel to the game. The sequel took the series to a higher level, and although still getting the M rating for exactly the same reasons, this didn't deter it being on everyone's Christmas wish list in 1998. Although the blood and violence remained, it was perhaps most memorable for the cerebral bore, which fired a projectile which on contact would drill itself into the skull of your enemy before exploding. Not only a guaranteed headshot but also a decapitation at the same time. Nobody ever forgets the first time they used that weapon, and seeing an enemy's head blow off and then their lifeless body falling to the ground as blood sprayed all over the place is certainly one of the most memorable moments in N64 gaming. Both Turok 1 and 2 had HD remasters recently, and with some gameplay updates and tweaks, the N64 versions are really only for those who crave N64 shooters. For everyone else, I'd recommend playing the remasters which are much more accessible to the modern audience. Turok 3 is a game which many people forget was ever released, and if the comments section over on my review of the game is anything to go by, some people didn't even realise that there was a Turok 3. As a late N64 release, and one which was somewhat rushed to capture a dwindling player base, it really divides opinion. The majority of gamers rate Turok 2 as the best in the series, but I always personally preferred 3. Clearly taking inspiration from Half-Life, the game had branching paths and different characters to play as. One thing that remained however is the violence. The downside though is that bodies disappear after you've killed them in an attempt to help the game's engine cope. Strangely though, it makes the game feel less violent. Despite still getting its M rating, it felt to me the least deserving rating of any of the 3 Turok games. With multiplayer games like Unreal Tournament becoming increasingly popular and online gaming becoming a trend, it's no surprise that Acclaim wanted to cash in with the same console-based multiplayer only offering with Turok Rage Wars. This only got its M rating for animated violence, so on paper it's the most mild in the Turok series to get the M rating, and when playing the game you'll see why. It doesn't quite have the same edge as the single player story modes of the other games. Still, for anyone looking for a deathmatch shooter that's best played with friends, then Rage Wars is a cool addition, but for solo play it's really worth not rushing to own. With the N64 being known for having perhaps the best set of wrestling games on any console ever, it's a shame that the only M-rated one was a rushed mess. As a big ECW fan, I was stoked when I heard they were getting their own game. then quickly became disappointed when I saw that after the wrestling license merry-go-round at the time, it was in fact Acclaim that would be making it. Known as one of the most extreme wrestling promotions for the time, some of the edginess made its way into the game, with its violence and language. Being able to have inferno and barbed wire matches would certainly have caught the attention of the ESRB, but it was the dated controls, weak visuals and poor gameplay which turned most gamers off it. With so many Ecw wrestling games to choose from, don't be in a hurry to play Ecw Hardcore Evolution. Originally planned as the first entry into a spin-off series that was proposed, Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero turned out to be one of the worst games to not only have the Mortal Kombat name attached to it, but it was one of the worst games ever made. Now I'm sure you've already seen the AVGN episode of this game, but in short there's very little here which is redeeming. From the awful controls, the horrific platforming, and the near impossible difficulty. Only the most die-hard gamers would ever have made it to the game's ending. The only saving grace is the amount of gore and the sometimes humorous ways in which it's possible to die in the game. At times it plays out like watching an episode of 101 Ways to Die, and that's funny in its own right because you're likely to die 101 times within the first hour of playing the game. 1996 saw the release of Wargods in arcades, and the Nintendo 64 port arrived the following year in 1997. Despite being a new IP, it's often mentioned that this was intentionally a way to test Midway's new 3D fighting game engine without the risk of putting the Mortal Kombat brand on it from the start. The game has a cool concept whereby you play as humans who have come into contact with a mysterious ore which has turned them into Wargods, hence the game's title. Although I personally thought most of the characters were pretty cool, that was actually one of the biggest criticisms, as many reviewers at the time found them to be uninspired and met the game with a lukewarm reception. The N64 version would have actually been out sooner, but it was delayed to reduce the difficulty level and to add additional moves. One thing that didn't change, however, was the game's violence, which continues the Midway trend of having fatalities. They are not as gruesome for the most part as other Midway fighting games, but nevertheless, when combined with the animated violence, this game got its M rating. With Quake still having a following across the world, it's no surprise that the chance to make a quick port and some quick cash was too good to turn down. Although the port of Quake to N64 improved some areas, many others were weakened and some levels were cut completely. I wouldn't therefore class this as a must-own title, especially when the PC game is so easy to get hold of these days. But still, for its time, it was a cool addition to the N64 library, only having 2-player deathmatches support that perhaps hurt the game somewhat, but the same level of gore found in other versions of the game remained intact. Quake 2 on the other hand was a new experience, and with expansion pack support it looks and runs great. The game has a new plot and level set than the PC version, and so although the game has fewer levels, it plays in a nice and concise manner. Throw in 4-player deathmatches and the same cool ambient style music found in Doom 64, and this is definitely a game every N64 owner should own. The M rating here was for the violence and blood, which is correct, but it never comes across as violent as some other games on this list do. After further developing the Wargods engine, Midway were confident enough to put the Mortal Kombat brand back in issue, and for the first time in 3D. While fans of the series will often debate about how good of an entry Mortal Kombat 4 was, I personally quite enjoyed it. It's true that it doesn't quite have the same feel as the 2D classics, and the severely streamlined roster certainly didn't help it to appeal to fans of some of the more obscure characters in the universe. But it delivered what I felt was a more mass market 3D fighter than a game which offered too much fan service. Fatalities were unsurprisingly the reason for the game's M rating, and when combined with the weapon-based contact and the usual dousing of blood, this ESRB rating was no surprise to anyone. Another PC to N64 port came in the form of Duke Nukem 64. The game was already aged by the time of the Nintendo 64 release, and there are some changes to the adult themes. Saying that, the game still managed to retain its M rating, despite not being able to kill the babes, the red light district being renamed, and the adult bookstore being replaced by a gun store. Heck, even the steroids were changed to instead be named Vitamin X, and the swearing in the game is non-existent. There are many other changes, but despite that, the blood, mild language and animated violence was enough of a reason for the ESRB to retain the M rating, which was also the case with many other ports of the game. The unique entry into the Duke Nukem series arrived with 0 Hour. Despite the game moving from a first-person shooter into a third-person one, fans of the series will be pleased to know that much of the same Duke Nukem style and action remained. The plot sees Duke travelling in time, and there are some true historical elements thrown in. For instance, in one level, Duke arrives in Victorian England and finds the recently murdered Mary Jane Kelly, who was a real-life victim of Jack the Ripper. In a cool twist though, this could technically have intertwined with Shadow Man's opening, as both use the same serial killer, but alas there's no actual in-game crossover, as cool as that would have been. Featuring a real-life murder, the same crass humour and language expected from Duke, and the usual over-the-top violence, the M rating seems in place here. Although like some other games on the list, there are far more graphic games with the same rating. 1999 certainly turned out to be one of the most adult-friendly eras for the N64 owners. As we look forward to the new Resident Evil 2 coming out shortly, let's take a look back to the awesome port of the game to the Nintendo 64. Whilst often remembered for its incredible job bringing a ton of full motion video with it, let's not forget the blood, gore and violence that made this for many the pinnacle of survival horror games. Now becoming increasingly expensive for N64 owners to pick up, the game still offers a ton of gameplay and one of the best storylines found on the console. Blood, gore and violence were the reasons for this game's M rating, but personally it was the overall creepy sense of isolation that the game offered that really drew me in. A trio of games now from Acclaim, and whilst none of them are particularly memorable, they were in fact all M rated like the show they were based on. South Park was the first-person shooter built on the Turok engine, which was originally titled South Park Deep Impact. Even Matt and Trey said it was a crappy game, and Iguana Entertainment also hated making the game, as Acclaim pushed them to be able to release the game to cash in on the Christmas market that year. No surprises then that it's not much fun to play, and it landed its M rating for comic mischief and strong language. Although I expect that most people will only remember the game for its annoying turkeys. Chef's Love Shack may have been a fairly forgettable quiz-style game, but it still managed to pack in comic mischief and mature sexual themes. The prize of actually winning the game show was some passionate time with Chef, which makes it even more strange when the South Park kids replace local women in the game's loose storyline. With fairly weak gameplay, a dire single player mode, and a multiplayer offering which has limited replayability, South Park Chef's Love Shack was a dud on arrival in 1999. Rounding off the N64 South Park trilogy was South Park Rally. As a general rule of thumb, it's pretty hard to make a poor kart racer. Just take the characters everyone loved from South Park, make some cool courses for them to drive around, and throw in some fun weapons. Sadly then, somehow they managed to turn what should have been a great title into a confusing mess which plays just as poorly as it handles. Despite getting its M rating for comic mischief and strong violence, the fact that Saddam Hussein appears in the game was no doubt enough for the ESRB to quickly come down strongly, as they did with the rest of the series. As is the case with all South Park N64 games, I really wouldn't recommend them to anyone unless you're a huge South Park fan or you're seeking some nostalgia. With the show being huge at the time of the game's release, I'm sure like myself many of you snapped up these games back in the day, eager to get your hands on anything linked to the TV show. With Hexen it was animated violence and blood which got the game its M rating on N64, PC, PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. Looking back now, the pixelated gore is quite comical, but the N64 is known as being the most accurate PC translation. I never personally found much enjoyment in the game, but I do know it has a huge following. For me though, the confusing level design and the inability to remap the controls made it difficult to play, as the control layout isn't all that intuitive on N64. Though for anyone looking for a fantasy action game, you may be able to overlook the lack of hardware improvements the N64 version offers and enjoy the game. There's very little to be said about Daikatana that hasn't already been said in many other reviews and retrospectives of the game. with one of the most messy development cycles and perhaps one of the most laughably bad marketing campaigns, Daikatana quickly became known as a bad game. So bad in fact that the Game Boy Color version of the game was cancelled in North America because the publisher felt that Daikatana as a brand was already dead in the water by that point. Animated blood, gore and violence were the ESRB's reasons for giving this game an M rating, but that only stopped younger gamers from experiencing this shoddy title. It's known as one of the biggest commercial flops in video game history, and rightly so. Just avoid this title on any platform and any system. Finishing off this journey comes Rare's second entry onto the list. Perfect Dark, often considered the best first-person shooter on the console, wasn't shy from offering the player the chance to deliver multiple crimson masks. Whilst I don't feel that the violence is over the top or anywhere near that seen in other games such as Doom 64 for example, the frequent humans you mow down and the vast arsenal of weapons to do so with means that you have multiple ways to kill what for the time were fairly lifelike enemies. According to the ESRB, they also gave the game this rating because you can also kill civilians, although they did comment that this often resulted in penalties. They also noted the ability to continue to shoot dead bodies, which further adds to the amount of blood on the floor, and also huge splattering of blood when enemies are shot. This is one instance where the gameplay was so good that you often didn't notice the level of violence because it seemed to fit in perfectly with the game and didn't appear to be used as a shock tactic. I would have been interested to see the ESRB's views on the cancelled feature, which would have allowed you to put your own face and those of others onto the characters in the multiplayer mode, but alas that was cancelled for tragic reasons. So for a console often considered as a kid-friendly system, the Nintendo 64 certainly had its fair share of blood, violence, gore, mischief, and games which would have appealed to adults. It's also funny to have seen two titles get on the list for sexual themes, which for the time was fairly shocking to see and hear on a Nintendo console. What I also found interesting was that I initially assumed that Midway would have been the developer with the most M-rated games on the system, but looking at the list it was in fact Acclaim who published titles that take the crown. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what your favourite M-rated Nintendo 64 game was. I'd also love to know of any other M-rated titles from other platforms that you would have liked to have seen being ported to the N64. I also find it interesting to hear your views on the ESRB and if the rating system ever stopped you being able to actually get your hands on a game you wanted back in the day. I personally don't remember a single instance where my local game store ever questioned me here in the UK, despite being underage for most of these titles when they were first released. Did you ever have any experiences like this? As always though, let me know your thoughts, feelings, opinions and comments down below, and until next time.